Buenos dias, fanáticos de objetivos. It's time for another lens shootout video, and this time we will compare 5 different ultra-wide-angle full-frame f2.8 zoom lenses. Only one of them costs less than $1,000 US, so the f2.8s are in a more expensive category than that of the f4s that I did in a previous video, but the rewards they yield are well worth it. This will be a mega shootout between Canon, Nikon, Sony, Tamron, and Tokina, all mounted on a 42 megapixel Sony A7R II full-frame mirrorless camera. Some lens adapters will be used as well. After all, adaptability is one of the unique capabilities of the E-mount camera system. Even a Nikon D850 will appear briefly. Now let's take a look at the lineup of lenses that include my scripted opinions before any testing was performed, so there are no spoilers here. The first up in the running of this contest is the Canon EF 16-35mm Mark III that was released in October 2016 as a long overdue update to the 2007 Mark II. From other videos I've seen on YouTube, it looks like this lens might prove to resolve the most level of detail in this shootout, at least in the center of the image. I don't know about the corners though. Next up is Nikon's old 14-24mm lens, but however well it may have performed relative to the market when it first came out, some of the modern reviews on it are not so good. Some of them, not all of them. To be fair though, it was released back in 2007, and this 14-24mm model, however, was the most suitable ultra-wide f2.8 zoom from Nikon I could find for this video that is still current on the market. So if it loses the shootout, hopefully we could just blame the era it comes from. How come Nikon doesn't make a modern-style 16-35mm f2.8 by now? Next up is the Sony G Master 16-35mm that will prove to be very important for E-mount cameras. Released in 2017, it is the newest lens in the running, and therefore 10 years newer than the Nikon. It is the only E-mount lens in the running, so it doesn't require an adapter, and it should yield the best autofocus performance on an E-mount camera. At least one thumbs down would be the fact that it is the most expensive lens of the 5, so start saving up now if you want to get one. Otherwise, I actually think this lens is going to win the overall of the shootout. But we will see, won't we? The next lens is the Tamron 15-30mm VC lens that was released in February 2015. Perhaps the best feature about this lens is that it is the only one that has optical stabilization built in, so it might be the most suitable for video shooters. Its corner sharpness and vignetting seem to get good reviews, and thankfully it comes much cheaper than the Canon, Nikon, and especially the Sony. I don't think that the Tamron will win the overall, but it might win some of the individual tests. The last up in this video is the Tokina 16-28mm. Since it was released in 2010, it might have some limitations, and it seems like most of its reviews I found came from many years ago when the Canon Mark III, Sony G Master, and Tamron models didn't exist to give competition. I don't think this lens will score very high, but one thing is undeniable. It is the cheapest of the 5, and by a good margin too. It costs about 1/3 the price of the 2007 Nikon, which is a huge savings. Honorable mention goes to the brand new Tamron FE mount 17-28mm f2.8 lens that is sure to excite Sony E-mount users. It was announced during the time I was in the process of editing this video, but what a great surprise it was to see it appear out of nowhere on the rumor mill. So before we begin the examinations, here is a quick overview of the main categories of the shootout. And this is the criteria I used for this video, but you can also find it posted in the video description below. But in real quick summary, all lenses will be tested only on Sony cameras, and chapter selections are available in the video description below, especially for those of you who just want to watch the image quality test like a hit and run. We start off with lens mounting. However, there's nothing to report this time, as surprisingly none of them were too stiff to mount or too loose fitting on the adapter. In this video I used a Metabones Mark IV adapter for the Canon mount lenses and a Metabones Nikon G to E mount adapter, and they both mounted nicely, not being too stiff or loose. In some past lens shootout videos, there have been some lenses and adapters that cause some minor grief, but not this time, so that's a good thing. Okay, enough of that. Now let's move on to the focus ring performance test. The first two things we will look at are the smoothness and the dampening of the ring. By smoothness I mean, does the focus ring feel smooth or gritty? And by dampening, or drag, I mean, is it stiff or loose to turn? The Canon focus ring is very smooth, yet still mediocre at the same time, because there is a little bit of grittiness. It's not bad, but there is better. The drag is very soft and needs to be stiffer, but its dampening is not the worst. I had higher hopes for the smoothness of the Nikon's focus ring, but maybe I'm being too picky because it isn't bad. It's just that there are 3 other lenses that were smoother to operate. Same story with the dampening. I found the drag to be slightly worse than the Canon's. The Sony leads by example with the smoothest focus ring out of all 5 lenses. Likewise does the dampening have just the right amount of drag on it. Not too much or too little. It really is perfect. The Tamron's focus ring was a close second to the Sony's, as its smoothness and drag were both greater than the rest, yet lesser only to the Sony. The Tokina ring was moderately smooth to operate, which is still decent, but here's the thing. It is true that it was a little bit gritty, more so than the Nikon, but the main thing was that it makes a metallic rubbing sound in manual mode, but it doesn't do that in automatic mode. How strange. The complaining is not over. The drag on it is too soft, yet no more or less than the Canon's. Just for reference, here are some audio samples of all 5 lenses. It is seen here that I have given points to each lens for its smoothness and dampening performances, and the Sony is leading the way with 10 points so far. Now let's take a look at the grips to see how they feel. The grip on the Canon was quite ergonomic and was the widest of the 5 lenses, and so the grip was the best attribute of the Canon's focus ring. But the downside of it was that it was the only focus ring that had lots of slop in it. In spite of that, it was still my favorite grip to use. The Nikon's focus grip was decent, but mediocre because it was somewhat thin, and I wished that it could have been wider. I did like the fact that its higher elevation than the zoom ring made it easy to find in the blind though. It had a little bit of slop, but not enough to be a problem. The grip of the Sony was a little more mediocre than the Nikon's, partly because it was also somewhat thin, but mainly because the height of the grip is too low against the case of the lens on one side, so my fingers sometimes rubbed against the body of the lens, which is kind of annoying. The Sony is the only lens in this lineup with a focus-by-wire mechanism, something that can be dreaded, but its performance actually felt quite mechanical, so no worries there. The Tamron's focus grip was the worst of the 5, partly because it was the thinnest, And just like the Sony, my fingers rubbed against the lens's body too easily. So that was a thumbs down. Then again, if you only use this lens in automatic mode on a DSLR, then you wouldn't have to worry about it. The Tokina's grip was nice and wide with good ridges on it, but here's the thing. The forward side is slightly covered by the lens's casing in manual mode, but even more so in automatic mode. Not that such would matter much, I'm just trying to be empirical about it. Anyway, most people don't like the push-pull style focus ring, and neither do I. While I didn't feel any slop in it, it does make clicking sounds when changing directions with moderate to high intensity. But fortunately not with low intensity, which is how it would be used maybe 95% of the time anyways. Nevertheless, the grip itself is quite nice and exceeded all the others but one. It was lesser only to the Canon. So in conclusion, the Sony scored the most points overall at 12, just barely surpassing the Canon. Hopefully the Nikon has a better zoom ring. So that is what we will move on to now, the zoom ring performance test. The Canon zoom ring is quite decent overall. It is fairly smooth with only a bit of roughness, but not enough to cause worry. The drag is too soft though, but there was worse. The grip is fairly wide and the ridges are excellent, so it was a comfortable zoom ring to operate. The Nikon zoom ring did not excite, unfortunately. It was clearly the grittiest to turn, and the drag was way too soft. Even the grip was the worst to operate of the 5 lenses because it was recessed too far into the barrel of the lens. I would have liked it to have protruded from the barrel more so that my fingers would not rub on the case. It also had a lot of slop in it. The Sony turned out a great performance overall. Its zoom ring was perfectly smooth with no roughness in it, and the dampening was neither too stiff nor too soft. The feel of the grip, however, wasn't so impressive. Even though it is actually quite decent, it's just that there were 3 other lenses that had better grips on the zoom ring. The Sony's was a bit on the narrow side. The Tamron zoom ring performed just like the Canon's, fairly smooth with only a bit of grittiness. The drag was close to ideal, but just a bit too soft. So it was a notch stiffer than the Canon's. That sounds pretty good so far, right? Well, the Tamron zoom ring's best attribute was actually the feel of the grip, as it was the widest of the 5 with nice ridges for ergonomic usability. This really was the best zoom ring of the 5. Now the Tokina. I'm afraid to tell you. I'm just kidding. Surprisingly, it was just as smooth as the Sony. However, it sure didn't have the Sony's dampening though. The Tokina was way too stiff, especially at 16mm, where for some reason it is very stiff, then from 20mm and up, it was just stiff. The grip was okay, with nice deep ridges, but it was a bit narrower than the Canon and the Tamron. There was a tiny bit of slop, but not enough to cause any worry. Before we look at the final scores, here are some audio samples of what these zoom rings sound like. Turkey. So in conclusion of the zoom ring test, the Sony came close to another win, but the Tamron ended up taking the overall win, while the Nikon got eclipsed by bigger stars. Okay, enough of that. Now for the part you have all been waiting for, the all-important image quality test. We will focus on each lens's 3 widest f-stops, where the green shading generally represents the greatest level of sharpness improvement. In this case from f2.8 to f4, then f5.6 might get a little better, But then from f8 and beyond, in the red shading, you will probably not notice anything. Since these lenses have such different zoom ranges, only 2 universal focal lengths will be used. 16mm at the wide end because it is the widest focal length that all 5 lenses have in common, and 24mm at the telephoto end for the same reason. So now we start off in 16mm with the center pineapple, and these 2 scales will be the main focus for comparison. There is no 5th place because 4th place was a tie between the Sony and the Tamron, as I could not tell them apart. In 3rd place is the Nikon that was just a little bit sharper, but not much though. In 2nd place, unexpectedly, is the Tokina, the one lens I thought would be in 5th place, but it was only sharper than the Nikon by a bit. Finally, in 1st place is the Canon that was significantly sharper than 2nd place. Here are all 5 lenses side by side for comparison. Stopping down to f4, all 5 lenses were so close that they all tied for 2nd place, except for the Tamron, which was just a tiny bit sharper for 1st place. It was a tough call though, because they all looked good. At f5.6, the sharpness levels were again very similar, but in 1st place the Canon just barely edged out the Sony, Tamron, and Tokina, while the Nikon was only very slightly the dullest for 3rd place. The Canon is in the lead with 14 points for the center of the image, while the Tokina unexpectedly trails behind in 2nd. Now we will go off to the corner pineapple where performance is more demanding and has a wider range of results than what we saw in the middle of the image. These are the 2 scales that the sharpness will be based on. At f2.8, we start off in 5th place with the Tokina, as it looks horrible. 4th place only got slightly better with the Nikon. The Tamron gets a tad sharper for 3rd, then 2nd place got way sharper. And that was the Sony. The Canon was only slightly sharper than the Sony for 1st place, as the 2 were very close. Look at the difference between the 1st and the last. The Tokina got smoked by the Canon. Now here are all 5 side by side for comparison. When stopped down to f4, the Canon and the Sony both seemed to be equally the sharpest, so they tied for 1st. The Nikon looks pretty good sitting in 2nd place, but the only lens that looked quite dull was the Tokina in last place. At f5.6, the Canon alone was the sharpest, and the Sony trailed behind in 2nd. So in the corner pineapple test, even though the Sony did very well in 2nd, the Canon scored a perfect upper limit of 15 points in the corner, meriting 1st place. You know, this is interesting because we saw that in my last video with the f4 ultra-wide zoom lenses, that it is possible for some DSLR lenses to get just a little duller when adapted onto a mirrorless body in the 10mm, and this applied even to the Canon f4. But here in the f2.8 shootout, the Canon, a lens that was adapted, was still the sharpest at 16mm in the corner. Now, in summary of the center and corner of the 16mm test, the Canon beat them all in the overall with a good margin at 29 points. The Sony came in 2nd, but interestingly, the Nikon, Tamron, and Tokina all tied for 3rd place overall with 18 points. This is uncommon, but in this case there was no clear loser. However, notice that the Sony happened to do well in the corner, but not so well in the center, whereas the Tokina was the opposite, performing well in the middle of the image, but fell apart in the corner. Now it is time to move on to the center pineapple at 24mm with f2.8 wide open. I'll give you a heads up, some interesting things started happening at 24mm. So of the 5 lenses, which one will start us out in 5th place? It is the Tokina, as you might have guessed, but it is actually 4th, because the Nikon and the Tamron both tied for 3rd. In second place, the Canon gets only a little bit sharper, and the Sony comes in at the sharpest. Here are all 5 side by side for comparison. Stopping down to f4, the Nikon and the Canon tied for third. The Sony improved a little bit for second, and the Tamron and the Tokina tied for first, as I could not tell them apart. Stopping down to f5.6 had some real surprises. The Nikon came in first place this time. The Tamron continues to do pretty good overall in the center at 24mm, but the Sony and especially the Canon were the dullest. So the Tamron scored the most points in the center of the 24mm test, putting an end to the Canon's domination. Now it's time to test the corner of the image again in f2.8, and oh my gosh, look how bad the Tokina looks in last place. The Nikon is still a ways off from first place, but it is at least noticeably better than the Tokina. Third place gets a lot sharper too. Which lens do you think that is? It is the Sony. Second place only got a little bit sharper than the Sony, and that was the Canon. That means that first place went to the Tamron, which is looking impressively sharp. Look at how the Tokina got creamed by the Tamron. Now here are all 5 lenses side by side for comparison. When stopped down to f4, surprisingly the Tamron fell from a greater height in the corner by getting worse than it looked at f2.8, while the opposite happened in the center of the image, meaning its center f4 improved quite a bit. How strange. When looking at all 5, the Canon looks pretty decent, but the Sony was clearly the sharpest in first place. At f5.6, there was no 5th or 4th place because the Sony and the Tamron, interestingly, tied for third. The Nikon was just barely sharper than both of them for second, and the Canon tied with the Tokina for first place. So in the corner of the 24mm test, the leading lens with 12 total corner points was the Canon. If we add up the center and corner 24mm scores together, then the Sony scored the most points overall at 22, with the Tamron trailing in second place at 21. Now, if we add up all the scores from both focal lengths, we can finally see which lens won the image quality shootout, and congratulations goes to the Canon in first place with 50 points. Just as I predicted before I rented these lenses, based on other people's reviews, it did look like it would be the sharpest f2.8 ultra-wide. The Canon's f2.8 performance was terrific, especially at 16mm, but the only time it faltered was in 24mm at f5.6 in the center. But it didn't look bad. The other lenses just happened to be only a tad sharper, so there's really nothing to worry about there. In second place was the Sony that turned out a very good overall performance, with its highlight being that it rendered the best in-class overall sharpness at f4. But its weakest overall performance was at f5.6, where stopping down past f4 didn't really help it to improve, which is kind of odd, but can happen. In third place, the Nikon did not deliver the performance at the level of the Sony and especially the Canon, but just a couple things though. In many cases, the Nikon still looked decent even when it had a low score compared to the other lenses. And in my last video where I did the f4 ultra-wides, the Nikon f4 model really did look dull in that shootout. So I think that at least the f2.8 version performed noticeably better than the f4 version did. Here is a 2018 article with some stellar photography in it using the Nikon 14 to 24mm. Photography that is beyond what I could do. But the author said that this lens is razor sharp. Well, up till standards relative to the market of February 2015, it probably was, but not now. If you are really looking for a razor-sharp ultra-wide f2.8 zoom in 2019, this is not the one. In fourth place was the Tamron. that turned out a better performance in the center of the image, which is good, but I was led by some external factors to believe that we would see a stronger performance in the corners. Not what I expected, but not a big deal either. But I did think that the Tamron would have scored higher in the corner though. Here is a March 2018 article I found stating amazing things about its image quality. Well, it's good, but as we have just seen, it's actually only middle of the road compared to the Sony and especially the Canon. Neither did this article make a distinction between the center and the corners, which I think is important. In fifth place, if we were to only have looked at the overall level of sharpness in the center of the image and leave it at that, then the Tokina would have been as sharp as the Canon. But it was the worst lens in the corner. See that? That was a low score. In fact, in the f4 shootout video, the Tokina didn't do so well in the corner there either. So in this video, the corner dullness was the Tokina's downfall as an f2.8 as well. It is again reminded to DSLR users that this whole image quality test is based off the results obtained on a Sony a7R II only. Any possible discrepancy over adapters or whatever can be expected from these lenses on DSLR bodies is intentionally beyond the scope of this video. The viewer's understanding of this is appreciated, and I do hope that this test, executed the way it was as informative as possible. Now it is time to move on to the image stabilization test, but there were two minor problems. The first was a significant one. The Tamron is the only lens in this shootout that has the optical stabilization feature, but I still want to compare it to something. So what I'm going to do is compare it to the Canon EF 16-35mm f4IS lens that won the stabilization test in my f4 ultra-wide zoom shootout video. The Canon f4 ultra-wide was quite stable, and so it sets a high standard. So now let's see if the Tamron can beat it. In this scene, the IS of the Canon f4 lens is turned off. Now it is turned on. Now here is the Tamron with its vibration compensation turned off. Now it is turned on, and it appears to be no less stable than the Canon. Here they are side by side for comparison at 100% crop, and now at 400% crop. And it is delightful to see that the Tamron is just as stable as the Canon. But now here is the second problem, a minor one. The Metabones Nikon G to Sony E-mount adapter I rented does not transmit optical stabilization data. So for the test just seen, I used a borrowed Nikon D850 from the local pro shop. This was briefly referred to back in the introduction. Just to be thorough, here is another angle of the office room, and once again the Tamron does seem to be keeping up with the Canon, so that's great news. So in a sense, the Tamron won the image stabilization test, at the least because it is the only lens in this video that can do it, and at best, it performed well against another competent lens outside of this shootout. Well, that was quick. So now we move forward to the distortion test. Just like the image quality test, only the focal lengths of 16 and 24mm will be performed. However, the aperture will be set to f4 exclusively. At 16mm especially, the field of view was so wide that it put the lens so close to the grid chart as to cast a shadow on it that showed up at the bottom center of the image. There was nothing I could do about it, but fortunately it doesn't matter for this test. All we need to focus on here is the grid. Just note that each lens has its own field of view, which is a bit distracting, though not a big deal, and you will see what I mean in just a moment. We start off at 16mm in third place because there were lots of ties, and I found the results to be surprisingly close together, so this was not an easy test to judge. But anyway, In third was the Sony that was the only one that had some noticeable pincushion happening. The A7R II's distortion compensation was deactivated for this shot, and I had intended to show it compared with a shot of it turned on, but somehow I lost it. Sorry. I will comment more on this shortly. In second place was a tie between the Tokina and the Canon, as I could not tell them apart. Here are the left sides of the images of the Tokina and Canon side by side for comparison. In first place was also a tie between the Tamron and the Nikon. The Nikon revealed a bit more of the grid than the Tamron because it seems to have a wider field of view, but I still thought that these two lenses controlled the distortion the best at 16mm. The Tamron and the Nikon are in the lead so far, and now we move on to the 24mm test that proved to be a close race, and the scores were almost the same. In third place was a tie between the Sony and the Tokina. Here they are side by side for comparison. Now, regarding the Sony again, the distortion compensation is turned off here in this scene, and even when it was turned on, it virtually made no difference. Here it is again off, and here it is enabled. In truth, I have never felt that the Sony's in-camera lens comp software on my A7S, and now more recently on my A7R II, was really anything more than a disappointing gimmick, because generally I don't see enough of a difference to take it seriously. While others have also reported this, I have actually read that it also depends on the implementation of the software, which does vary from each brand and model, so just something to think about. Now on to second place that was just barely any better than the Tokina and the Sony is the Canon. And finally, the flattest images went to the Tamron and the Nikon again, as I could not tell them apart. Here they are side by side for reference. So the Tamron and the Nikon both took the lead in the overall of the distortion test. In truth, I've seen much worse distortion performance than this, so I think that all of these lenses here actually did well. But who knows, maybe some of them would have noticeably struggled beyond 24mm. In theory, the Sony with its in-camera lens correction is supposed to give it an advantage over the non-Sony lenses, but as we see here, that simply isn't the case. Anyways, now let's go on to the vignette test, where light falls off in the corners, using the 3 widest f-stops. We will be looking for the consistency of brightness from the center to the corners as a gradation of state change. We start off at 16mm with the Canon at f2.8, and the corners are really dark. In fact, I'll talk more about it later. When we stop down to f4, the whole image gets impressively brighter. And at f5.6, the corners continue to get brighter while the center stays the same. At f2.8, the Nikon is noticeably brighter than the Canon. And then the corners get noticeably brighter at f4. Then the whole image improved a small amount at f5.6. Moving on to the Sony at f2.8 with the lens shading compensation deactivated, but when stopped down to f4 and then f5.6, the degree of improvement followed the same pattern as the Nikon. But this time, if we go back to f2.8 with the shading comp activated, I'm not calling it a gimmick this time, because a noticeable difference can be seen. Here is the f2.8 with shading off again, and here it is enabled. And now here they are compared side by side. Here is the f4 again with the shading off. Now it is turned on. And finally here is the f5.6 with the shading comp off. Now it is turned on. And side by side, but almost no difference can be seen. At f2.8, the Tamron lens seems fairly good. And when stopped down to f4, the center and especially the corners brighten up nicely. But no real performance gain can be seen when stopped down to f5.6. Finally, we come to the Tokina at f2.8, and it seems even better than the Tamron. As expected, the corners brighten up at f4, and the improvement at f5.6 is there, but barely detectable. So now that we have seen the stopped down performance characteristics of each lens at 16mm, it is time to square them off in a shootout to determine how they rank in competition with each other. Starting off at f2.8 in 5th place is the Canon. Coming in at 4th place was the Sony, and that is with the shading comp activated since it did make a significant contribution. And yet, it wasn't that significant because there were still 3 other lenses with better vignette performance in the corners. In 3rd place was the Nikon that improved slightly over the Sony. And finally, 1st place went to the Tokina, as the gradation of light from the center to the corners was the brightest and most evenly distributed. Now let's move on to f4 in last place with the Canon again. The Sony was 4th again, and the Nikon was 3rd again. But this time the Tamron was the brightest in the corners for 1st place. Stopped down to f5.6, the Canon was not last this time, the Sony was. The Canon was 4th, but noticeably brighter in the corners than the Sony. In 3rd place, the Nikon stepped it up a little bit, but 1st place went to the Tamron, but not by much though. It was very slight. Here is the Tamron compared to the Sony, just to show how the first differed from the last. So that concludes the 16mm test, and the Tamron just barely edged out the Tokina for 1st place overall. Now it is time to do it all over again at 24mm, starting with the Canon at f2.8. When stopped down to f4, the whole image brightens up considerably, and then at f5.6, the corners improve moderately while the center stays the same. Moving on to the Nikon at f2.8, that improves noticeably stopped down to f4, and f5.6 does improve, but just barely. Now let's move on to the Sony now at f2.8 with the shading comp off. f4 did improve, but not by very much, and hardly any change is detected at f5.6. Now let's see if the shading compensation makes much of a difference. Here at f2.8 it is off, and now it is turned on. Now here they are side by side, and truthfully it barely makes a difference, which is surprising because at 16mm it did. The difference the shading comp made at f4 and f5.6 is not detectable, so the effect is back to being a gimmick again. Now moving on to the Tamron at f2.8 that looks fairly bright. Stopping down to f4 did make a noticeable improvement, but that is where it peaked, because stopping down to f5.6 did not yield any further improvement. Now the last lens up is the Tokina at f2.8, which looks impressively bright. Then the center and corners improve at f4, but when stopped down to f5.6, the corners are somehow very slightly darker, although one would probably not even see it most of the time. So now that we have seen the stopped down performance characteristics of each lens at 24mm, it is time to compare them all side by side to see which one produces the least amount of light fall off in the corners. Starting off at f2.8 in 5th place was the Canon again, and I'm tempted to say that the reason its vignette performance is so bad is because its image quality is so good. Maybe it was a direct trade-off somehow. In 4th place, the Nikon improved a bit over the Canon in both the center and the corners. 3rd place went to the Sony, and that is with the shading comp enabled. but when disabled, it was actually just a hair darker than the Nikon. And in first place again, the Tokina had considerably more even distribution of light from the center to the corners, which were quite bright. Check out this side-by-side comparison of the Tokina and the Canon. When stopped down to f4, the scores were almost the same. This time the Nikon was the darkest, followed by the Sony, then the Canon. Then in second, the Tamron doesn't improve in the corners, but it is much more consistent with the center of the image. Then the Tokina is just a tad brighter in the corners for first place. Now for the final run at f5.6, with the Sony in fourth place this time. In third place, the Nikon gets just a little brighter, but second was a tie between the Tamron and the Tokina as they look exactly the same. That only leaves the Canon, unexpectedly, to grab first place as it somehow controlled the fall-off of light the best. So here are the total scores for the 24mm test, with the Tokina taking the lead at 14 points. Now, if we total up all the scores from the 16mm and the 24mm tests, the Sony, Canon, and Nikon all scored pretty low, but it was a close duel between the Tokina and the Tamron. And so the winner of the vignette category of this shootout is the Tokina, with only one more point than the Tamron. Notice how the Sony tied for last with the Canon? In theory, the shading comp should give the Sony an advantage over the other lenses, but it didn't. Next up is the light transmission test, where we take a less clinical perspective of each lens's maximum aperture to see which lens at f2.8 is the brightest in the corners and the center at 16mm. Whichever one does will have the highest t-stop rating. Last place, unsurprisingly, was the Canon, as it produced the darkest image. The next lens is noticeably brighter, and one could predict that it was the Sony. In third, the Nikon does get a bit brighter, but nothing major. Second place goes to the Tamron. That is barely an improvement over the Nikon. One might even say that they are the same. I knew the Tokina would win. It is not only evident here, but when I was editing the image quality test, I always noticed how the Tokina often rendered the brightest images. Makes me wonder if the reason the Tokina is so bright is because it is so dull. Is there a direct trade-off involved? Now here is what I wish I had done in addition, is a 24mm test as well. But somehow at the time I just didn't think of that. My apologies. I won't overlook that next time though. Now it is time to move on to the bokeh tests. That will consist of 4 individual tests. In the first one, we will look at some outdoor images of bokeh at f2.8 during the day in the background of this chicken ornament. Starting off in 16mm in last place was a tie between the Sony and the Nikon, as their bokeh in the trees and in the grass below looked quite rigid. In third place was the Tamron that only improved over fourth by a small amount. I think that the grass is slightly smoother, but that is it. Second place finally looks good, and that was the Canon. Now the grass and especially the trees are smoothing over quite nicely now, but the Tokina melted away the hard edges the most, and is looking very smooth. Here is the Tokina and the Sony side by side for comparison. See the difference there? The Tokina assailed the Sony quite a bit. And here are all 5 side by side for comparison. Now let's zoom into the same image at 24mm, and this time the Nikon was last, as its background blur was quite busy looking. In fourth place, the Canon looks noticeably smoother, and yet there are still 3 more lenses that were smoother than that. The Tokina fell slightly to third place at 24mm, and was only a little bit smoother than the Canon. Second place went to the Sony. Oh, so close. But this time, the Tamron beat them all with the softest bokeh of the bunch. Here is the Tamron and the Nikon side by side for comparison. And here are all 5 side by side for comparison. The Tamron and the Tokina lead with 8 points each. Now let's move on to the indoor daytime bokeh image test by cropping into these windows that have straight edges. Starting off in 16mm in last place, this time was the Nikon. Third place was a small improvement by the Canon. Second was a tie between the Sony and the Tokina, as their smoothness really looked the same to me. Then finally, the Tamron produced the smoothest edges of the bunch. Here is the Tamron and the Nikon side by side for comparison. And here are all 5 side by side for comparison. Now let's zoom into 24mm where the Nikon was last again, as some of those edges are kind of defined. Third place was a tie between the Canon and the Tamron, as I could not see a difference between them. Can the Sony beat the Tokina to take first place this time? No, it can't, as the Tokina was noticeably smoother. And here are all 5 side by side for comparison. The Tokina is not tied with the Tamron anymore and pulls into the lead with 1 point. Indeed, we are seeing some good-looking bokeh out of both of these two lenses. The Nikon is not doing so well, and it doesn't look like it is going to catch up. Now let's look at the bokeh balls in the corner of the indoor daytime images at 24mm only, to see whether they deform or stay round. We'll move faster now and just show all 5 in a row, lay them all out. I don't usually do this, but the scaling of each image is slightly different for the purpose of fitting each bokeh ball cluster neatly into columns. Here are the ratings I gave, even factoring in how subjective they are. But I felt that the Tokina's balls were nice and round with soft edges and homogeneous faces, so to me that is a win. It is seen that in last place the Canon's balls are lemon-shaped, so I can only hope that the viewer agrees with me. The Tokina is pushing the lead over the Tamron by 2 points now, so with one more test to go, the outcome seems predictable by now. In this final test, we are looking at the bokeh balls near the center of the image at nighttime. Here are all 5 laid out again, with the cluster of importance being these ones here. The center scores in this test were similar to the corner ones from the previous test, unsurprisingly I would say, and they were scaled to fit their columns again. Once more, I thought that the Tokina looked the best, and the Canon looked the worst again for the same reasons. Check out the Sony, where some of the bokeh balls look like they were chomped by Cookie Monster. I've never seen that before. So there we have it. The Tokina lens produced the best looking bokeh overall with a comfortable lead over second. The Canon and especially the Nikon sure didn't go well. But at least shallow depth of field is probably not what most people would look for in an ultra-wide-angle lens anyway. Now it is time to move on to the close-up focus distance test, to see how close each lens can focus to a subject, my classic donkey figurine. Starting off in 4th place, which is last, is the Sony, which is typical for Sony lenses. In 3rd place was the Nikon that just barely cropped in past the Sony. It wasn't much, but it was closer. 2nd place was a noticeable improvement, and that was the Tamron. That leaves remaining the Canon and the Tokina, because they both tied for 1st place, as they looked the same to me. Here are all 5 lenses side by side for comparison. Finally, a test that didn't take all day, if you are even with me still at this point. Next up is my first ever focus breathing test. All of these lenses are very focal, of course, and this is something that pertains more to video work. We start off in 16mm and with an aperture of f2.8 exclusively, but in second guessing myself, maybe I should have used a slower speed. This was not an easy test to demonstrate visually because the range of distance between the hyperfocal to infinity focus was so small that instead I merely measured each lens's hyperfocal to infinity range of a flower in the lower left corner of this outdoor scene with Premiere's program monitor ruler guides. So here are the results. The Nikon showed the least amount of focus breathing, while the Sony breathed just a hair more. The Canon breathed a fair amount more than the Nikon, while the Tamron and the Tokina both breathed quite a bit more than the Nikon. I would like to have moved on to 24mm, but unfortunately I lost the files. I couldn't believe it. I searched the trash bin, the SD cards, but they're gone somehow. Damn it. Okay, now let's move on to the weight test. The weight of the two Metabones adapters are listed here in these two columns for reference. The first lens up on the scale is the Canon, weighing in at 824 grams with both caps on. The lens alone, without the caps, weighs 791 grams. The adapter brings it up to 939 grams, and the hood brings it up to 967 grams. So with 4 more lenses to go, we will see if the Canon is heavy or not. Next up is the Nikon lens, that weighs 1029 grams with both caps on. The body alone drops down to 980 grams, and the addition of the Nikon G to Sony E adapter pushes it up to 1154 grams, so that is heavier than the Canon. Next up is the Sony lens that weighs 769 grams with both caps on. The lens alone drops down to a featherweight 733 grams, and the hood raises it up to 764 grams. Next up is the Tamron lens, that weighs 1116 grams with both caps on. Without the caps, it is 1058 grams, and the addition of the Canon FE to Sony E adapter drives it up to 1231 grams. Holy smokes, that lens is a pig. The last up is the Tokina lens, that weighs 1024 grams with both caps on. The body alone falls down to 555 grams, and the adapter pushes it up to 1102 grams. So in summary, the specs of each lens are laid out on this chart, with the numbers in green being the most important ones, and it is seen that the Sony lens is the lightest, while the Tamron needs to go on a diet. Let me explain these columns quickly. The lens only column is a reference to the Canon and the Sony only, in the direct sense, because their hoods are removable. Otherwise, the weight of the Nikon, Tamron, and the Tokina lenses are conveyed in the indirect sense, because their hoods are unavoidably fixed. In these two columns, the weights are all the same except for the Canon because it was the only lens with a removable hood and that was used with an adapter. I hope that made sense, but anyway, if you are a Sony E-mount camera user, then the Sony lens would be as light and small as it gets. Now it is time to move on to the sun flare test that will consist of these two different tests. First, we will start off with the nighttime flood lamp video scene. In 5th place, the Tokina was the worst. It exhibits some rainbow prism flaring with 2 instances of shimmering. Then once the lights are out of the frame, a surge of sustained blooming occurs in the upper right, both on the entry and exit of the travel path. In 4th place was the Nikon, because it has the most blooming around the lights. It too shimmered twice, and bloomed briefly in the upper right with the light source out of the frame. In 3rd place, the Tamron bloomed around the lights too, but a lot less than the Nikon did. No shimmering was observed, although upper right entry and exit blooming did occur, but less so than the Nikon. In 2nd place was the Canon that controlled the light flare really well, which is the main thing, although a few shimmers did occur. and the upper right out-of-frame light bloomed to the same degree as the Nikon. Finally, in first place was the Sony lens that controlled the light flaring just as well as the Canon did, but there were no shimmers and the upper right blooming was so faint it can barely be seen. The Sony is in the lead so far, so now we move on to the next sun flare test, which is images of sun stars at f/16. In fifth, yet again, was the Tokina. The rays of the Tokina's sun stars were weakly pronounced, in that they were short and diffused. And look at this, there's that rainbow flaring again. The main difference between the Sony and the Tokina is that the Sony's sun star rays are longer. However, there are still 3 more lenses that I thought looked more angelic. The Sony's rays are a bit too diffused for my liking, and the randomization of the length of the rays are moderately uneven. In third place, the Nikon's sun star rendered some moderately articulated rays that extended beyond the reach of the Sony's. The biggest demerit is that the randomization of the length of the rays are greater than that of the Sony's. Second place went to the Tamron, which rendered the most articulated God rays of the 5 lenses, which is good, but sunray length randomization is still a problem. The Canon eliminated that randomization while rendering acceptably defined sun rays with decent reach. To me it looked the best, and I know it is partially masked by clouds in this image. I just could not get a cloudless sky, but the integrity of the sun star can still be surveyed enough in this instance. Here are all 5 sun stars side by side for comparison. Both sun star tests are concluded now, and the Canon ranked first place. The Tokina sure took a dive in this test, but I think we saw it coming, didn't we? Last up in the categories of this shootout is the Chromatic Aberration test, those wavelengths of light that get refracted away from a common focal plane, causing green and purple color fringing. We begin with the open book text test that I always like to do, in 24mm at f2.8. In last place, we start off with the Tokina. When we zoom into this image at 100% crop, some very strong purple color fringing is occurring in the in-focus areas of the text, and some green fringing is seen in the out-of-focus areas. In fourth place, the Nikon doesn't really have purple fringing problems, but the green fringing is the strongest of the 5 lenses. In third place, the Sony reduced the green fringing just a very small amount over the Nikon, and the in-camera chromatic aberration compensation is activated for this shot. It so happens that when the CA comp on my A7R II was disabled, the image looked identical to this here enabled one, unfortunately. The race for first place was a very close one between the Canon and the Tamron, and so second place went to the Canon. In first place, the Tamron has virtually no color fringing, and therefore looks really clean, but the Canon was very close. Here is the Tamron and the Tokina side by side, and here are all 5 lenses side by side for comparison. Let's do just one more CA test on the indoor corner bokeh balls we saw during the bokeh test at 24mm and f2.8 to see how a greater variety of colors stand up to fringing. All 5 lenses are here laid out with their scores, and you might have already noticed the color fringing in this scene from earlier in the video, but it just didn't get addressed at that time. The Tamron still looks quite clean around the edges of these bokeh balls, while the Nikon fringed quite a bit of green on the left side and orange on the right side of the balls. So in summary of the chromatic aberration test, last place was a tie between the Nikon and the Tokina, while the Tamron got a perfect score of 10, as it handled the color fringing really well. I am afraid that autofocus is excluded from this shootout for several reasons. The A7R II is not capable of autofocus with the adapter I used for the Nikon lens and the Tamron lens with an FX mount. And while the adapter used for the Canon and the Tokina is, their performance in video mode is sketchy compared to the AF achievable on their native DSLR bodies. There are other problems too, but there is just no way to objectively test autofocus in a shootout like this, because of the contrary mechanical attributes between native and adapted lenses. So now, after testing all the categories, it's finally time to draw some primary conclusions, followed by 3 different alternative comparisons. You will see what I mean in a bit. In starting off with the main comparison, the way the lenses were compared in this presentation, none of them exhibited any issues mounting onto the camera or the adapters, so no points will be awarded here. The best focus ring was on the Sony, but the Tamron had the best zoom ring. The Canon showed the best image quality, which is what people care about the most, but the Sony is here leading the overall by 1 point still. No points are conferred to the optical stabilization test because only one of the 5 lenses contributed to it. The Nikon and the Tamron both tied for the best distortion control. The Tokina had the best vignette and light transmission performances. That's not all. The Tokina also had the best bokeh performance, as well as tied with the Canon for the best close-up focus distance test. Despite these last victories by the Tokina, the Tamron is still comfortable in the lead with 31 points. The best focus breathing went to the Nikon, its first and only lone victory. The Sony was the lightest of the lenses, and the Canon had the best sun flare resistance. In the standings, the Canon and the Sony are fighting hard to surpass the Tamron, which is just barely holding on to first place. And finally, the best chromatic aberration performance went to the Tamron, securing the lead with 43 points, making it the winner of the shootout. This was most surprising to me, and I totally didn't see this coming. This juncture was the climax of the whole video, an excitingly nail-biting moment as I counted up every egg in the basket. This means that my original prediction, that the Sony would take the overall and win the shootout, was wrong. I really did not think the Sony would lose to the Tamron. This comparison is based on an equal scales method of testing the categories in this video, in order to keep the standards fair, but now let us take a more liberal view of these lenses in order to cast a different perspective on them. For instance, if we factor in the maximum points awarded to the Tamron for its unique optical stabilization ability that the other lenses do not have, the ranking of the scores would actually stay the same, but the difference would be that the integrity of the Tamron would rise above the other lenses even more than before. If we reset the stabilization scores back to the default, and acknowledge the only lens of the 5 that delivers native autofocus performance on a Sony camera, then that would be the Sony lens, of course. The Tamron and Tokina lenses with an EF mount, and the Canon lens also, render video AF capability on the A7R II with the Metabones Mark IV adapter that I used, and it is not bad, but it is not great either. Autofocus with a native lens cannot be beaten. That said, in this hypothetical comparison, the Tamron still takes the overall, this time with only 1 point. But the race between the Tamron, Sony, and the Canon is so close that one could really go either way with these lenses. This is a matter of splitting hairs. I will comment on this again shortly. Some of you might be thinking, hey, what about the total range of the zoom on these lenses? Doesn't that matter too? We will squish it in here at the bottom. It would to some, yes, and if that matters to you, then only the Sony and the Canon would deliver the greatest range of zoom, from 16 to 35 millimeters. The Nikon, however, has the shortest range, but it does have the widest focal length of the 5 lenses at 14mm, which for some, if you look at it that way, might be a deal breaker. It had no impact on the standings though, and the Tamron still wins. We could spend a lot more time correlating every possible alternative to subject to comparison, but I think that we've covered enough. We have to draw the line somewhere. Now, if I was in the market for one of these lenses for myself, I would probably not buy any of them, because the Tamron FE mount 17 to 28mm f2.8 has just been released. Indeed, the relevant Tamron here scored the most points overall, regardless of the criteria for comparison, and is therefore technically declared the winner of the whole shootout. But I'll be hypothetical here and just stick to the if-then postulate as to which would be my pick if I had to choose between these 5. To which I respond, I would buy the Sony. Let me first say that it is really a matter of balancing the level of personal compromise between quality and convenience. So I will start out with some negatives about the Sony before giving you my positives. I like image stabilization, but unfortunately that is only available on the Tamron. The Sony's vignetting was terrible, especially compared to the Tokina, which is a shame because I like bright corners, and neither did the shading comp do very much to help. The biggest downside for me was the fact that the Sony was the most expensive of the 5 lenses. The Tamron, which scored more points, is far cheaper. Despite all that, however, the Sony, the lens that ranked in 3rd place based on the main comparison, the format this whole shootout video is formally based on, would be my first pick. Ultimately, in my case, because of the native autofocus, small size and light weight, no need for an adapter, and the image quality was good. This would be my personal compromise of quality for convenience. Yours, however, may differ. If I was a Canon camera user, then the Tamron would definitely be my pick, even though the Canon lens was good. And if I was a Nikon camera user, then the Tamron would be a no contest, as I really did not care for the Nikon lens very much. In any case, the Tokina's image quality was just devastating, and showed too many other weaknesses as well. Once again, picking between the Sony and the Tamron for me is as stated, but it is tempting to second guess myself, because it is a tough call. One is like an expensive convenience, while the other is more like a complete economic package. Well, congratulations if you made it this far. I do hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. I have aspirations to make more of these shootout videos, but they are expensive and time-consuming, and that is why I only make one of them a year. This project has now taken me 6 months. Thanks again for watching, and see you next time.